For decades, Californians lived with a shadow that drifted from city to city, leaving behind fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. They didn't know his name, or even his face. They knew only the aftermath, homes that no longer felt safe, neighborhoods that felt watched, and police departments spread across counties chasing a phantom. The man who would later be unmasked as Joseph James DeAngelo Jr. carried many names before the truth came out. The Visalia Ransacker, the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, and finally the Golden State Killer. A single man, hiding in plain sight, responsible for a years-long string of break-ins, assaults, and murders that terrorized California from the 1970s into the 1980s. Joseph DeAngelo was born in 1945, and his early life already hinted at the darkness to come. Accounts from family members describe a childhood marked by instability and strict discipline. As a young man, he joined the Navy and later entered law enforcement, a profession that should have represented order and protection. Instead, it became a mask, a disguise. The badge gave him not just authority but insight into police procedures, evidence collection, and how officers responded to crimes. These were tools he would later use to avoid detection. After leaving the Navy, DeAngelo served as a police officer in 2 California departments. Colleagues described him as intense, sometimes volatile, but never outwardly suspicious. Yet even during these years, a series of burglaries and intrusions began cropping up in the areas where he lived and worked. These weren't typical crimes of opportunity. They were unnervingly calculated. Homes were watched for days or even weeks. Windows were tested. Routines were studied. In Visalia, in the mid-1970s, a strange offender was breaking into homes, often entering quietly, searching through belongings, and taking personal items that had little monetary value but great sentimental weight to their owners. Police called him the Visalia Ransacker. He seemed to enjoy studying the people whose homes he invaded, learning about their lives from the shadows. What no one realized at the time was that this phase was the beginning of something much darker. By the late 1970s, attacks began occurring in Sacramento and surrounding areas. These crimes were no longer limited to break-ins. They had escalated dramatically. The offender became known as the East Area Rapist. He focused on suburban neighborhoods, places where people felt safe. Victims reported that the intruder moved quietly, with an unsettling level of control and planning. He often entered homes before the attack actually took place, unlocking windows, placing ligatures, or arranging items in ways that gave him an advantage later. These were not spontaneous acts. They were premeditated, rehearsed, and purposeful. DeAngelo's training as a police officer gave him an edge. He understood how patrols worked, when people were likely to call in suspicious activity, and how long it would take for officers to respond. He monitored scanners and knew how to disappear before anyone arrived. He learned to confuse investigators by changing patterns, switching neighborhoods, switching days, altering the way he approached homes. Each crime seemed to evolve from the last, making him incredibly difficult to track. In some communities, neighborhood watch groups were formed, weapons were purchased, locks were upgraded, and people began sleeping lightly, jolting awake at the slightest sound. The fear was pervasive. No one could predict where he would strike next. Families moved, couples divorced, neighbors looked at each other with suspicion. California had never seen anything like it. As his crimes expanded to Southern California in the early 1980s, the offender changed once again. The escalation now included murder. Analysts debated whether the earlier crimes and the later ones were connected, but the patterns were unmistakable. The same meticulous preparation, the same fixation on control, the same behaviors echoed through each scene. Only years later would investigators confirm that the East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same person. Then, abruptly, the crimes stopped. The trail went cold. New cases took priority. For years, the Golden State Killer existed only in case files, survivor testimonies, and the memories of the detectives who had chased him. Some retired, still haunted by the unsolved investigations. Others believed the offender had died, or been imprisoned for unrelated crimes. What no one expected was that the man responsible simply slipped into an ordinary life. He worked in warehouses, raised children, lived in a suburban home, and blended seamlessly with the world around him. He was no longer the faceless phantom police had feared. He was a retired grandfather watering his lawn. But the case wasn't forgotten. In the 1990s and 2000s, advances in DNA testing began connecting old crimes together. Cold case detectives and criminologists kept digging, refusing to let the story fade. In 2016, investigators applied a new technique, uploading crime scene DNA to genealogical databases to find distant relatives of the offender. It was a controversial method at the time, but it yielded the most important lead in decades. From distant cousins, a family tree began to form. Branch by branch, name by name, investigators traced the connections until they narrowed down a suspect. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer living quietly in Citrus Heights. Surveillance teams collected his discarded DNA, and when the results came back, the match was undeniable. In April 2018, police surrounded DeAngelo's home. The arrest shocked the world. After decades of terror, the Golden State Killer finally had a name, a face, and a history laid bare. The man who had eluded law enforcement for so long was described by neighbors as polite, private, even ordinary. But beneath that exterior was the same calculating mind that had studied neighborhoods from the shadows. The courtroom became a place of reckoning. Survivors, many of them elderly now, described the fear, the trauma, and the decades of unanswered questions they'd lived with. DeAngelo, frail and in a wheelchair, spoke little. Eventually, he pled guilty to multiple charges in order to avoid the death penalty. And in August of 2020, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Joseph James DeAngelo is now spending his remaining years behind bars, but the damage he inflicted stretched across generations. His crimes changed how Californians locked their doors, how neighborhoods communicated, and how investigators approached serial offenders. He also left behind a legacy in forensic science. His case helped popularize modern genetic genealogy, a tool that has since solved dozens of long cold cases. The story of the Golden State Killer is not just a tale of one man's brutality. It is a story about fear, perseverance, and the relentless pursuit of truth. It shows how a community can be terrorized by someone hidden in plain sight, and how decades later, science and determination can finally bring long-awaited justice. Joseph James DeAngelo lived many lives: soldier, police officer, husband, father, neighbor, and criminal. But history will remember him for the one life he tried hardest to hide, the life of one of America's most notorious predators, a man whose crimes were built on planning, manipulation, and the terrifying ability to move through the world unseen. And yet, after all the years he spent avoiding capture, it was a simple strand of DNA, silent, microscopic, and undeniable, that revealed exactly who he was.